Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the World Football Summit podcast. I'm your host, Jaime, CMO at World Football Summit. Today, we welcome Jordan Gardner back to the show, and the timing could not have been better. Jordan has a unique perspective on the different investment trends impacting the industry, given his role as a previous owner of FC Helsingor in Denmark, and now as an advisor to many groups and individuals looking for opportunities in football. With Jordan, we discuss the current ownership models in football, including multi-sport models, investment funds, or how athletes are investing more across sports. We also talk about how the projected market correction could impact the sports industry and the valuations of certain clubs. But we also get to talk about culture and leadership, picking up on the conversation we had on the very first episode of this show. In sum, if you're curious about the current ownership landscape in football, this is another great episode for you. But a quick disclaimer, this conversation is not or should not be taken as financial advice. It is provided for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. In fact, you can actually download your free copy of a special report on ownership and governance on our website, www.worldfootballsummit.com, or through the link in the show notes. But before we get into it, I think you're probably planning your 2023 strategy, correct? Well, mark your calendars, as we have already opened our pre-register forms for Football Innovation Forum in Istanbul on June 9th. And yes, you have that right. That is the day before the city hosts the Champions League final. And you can now enjoy our early bird offer for WFS Europe in Sevilla on September 20th and 21st. Purchase your ticket today and benefit from a 25% discount on all tickets to the event. The biggest football industry event is already on the horizon. So if you want to join the leaders that will shape the future of football, this is your opportunity. Head over to www.worldfootballsummit.com. Again, that's www.worldfootballsummit.com and buy your ticket. And with that, our conversation with Jordan Gardner. Well, Jordan, it's great to have you back on the World Football Summit podcast. Actually, you're the first guest that actually comes back. So yeah, looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be back.
So Jordan, there's a lot of things that I want to talk to you about, especially because the industry is seeing so many changes and dynamics in terms of investment. But before going into that, I want to know, what is life after FC Helsingor? What are you up to now? I don't know if you want to share with the audience what you're up to now.
Yeah, so I am currently doing consulting work for a company based out of London called 21st Group. It's a really interesting company, data focused, has a couple different verticals. They help clubs, they help teams, leagues, commercial partners really make smarter decisions. The areas that I help out on are specifically on M&A activity, more so with Americans looking to invest in football and European football. So whether that's institutional groups in the United States, whether that's high net worth individuals, kind of working with them to see strategically what's the best way to both invest their money and then look towards building out the right infrastructure after purchase. So that's been keeping me busy. Obviously, a lot of conversations with so many different groups, Americans looking at the space. So, taking some time to relax, and then at some point in the coming year, I'll jump back on the club side. But for now, it's interesting to kind of see the lay of the land in terms of what the industry trends are, and it's obviously a very exciting time to be in the space.
Well, when you get back to, let's say, the club world, we're going to have to bring you back for a third time.
Sure, happy to.
Anyway, Jordan, so one of the reasons why I thought it was a great time to bring you back is because I saw a post that you shared on LinkedIn, and basically it said something along the lines that 62% of the professional European football clubs are now controlled by US investors, and that the majority of the deals, I think it was like 2/3, had taken place over the past 3 years. So to start things off, I want to understand from you. I mean, what has changed? What triggers have led to this, and how come this has become so professional?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different things going on that are kind of behind those trends. I think first off, there's always been an interest in sports as an asset class in North America. I think, certainly going back 30, 40, 50 years. And I think the problem right now that you're seeing is the price points to the entry points to get into sport in North America are becoming exorbitant. I think, if you look 10 or 15 years ago, and you were a reasonably high net worth individual, you could invest in Major League Soccer, you could invest maybe in minor league baseball, maybe even at that time the NHL. But now we're getting to the point where the valuations of clubs, the entry points are so high to get into Major League Soccer, putting aside stadium infrastructure or working capital, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. Even something like the NWSL, the women's league, now you're looking at 40 or $50 million. So I think North American investors are looking and saying, we can put our money into North America, but it's kind of overvalued and oversaturated, whereas European football and global football is still seen as very much undervalued, right? You can get in, you can get a Premier League club for 100 to 125 million pounds. I think Bill Foley and his acquisition of Bournemouth was a really good case study in that, he successfully ran an NHL hockey team in Las Vegas, and Major League Soccer has been looking to go to Las Vegas to launch a team for quite some time. And he looked very seriously at launching a Major League Soccer franchise. But between the franchise entry point and building a stadium, a soccer specific stadium, you're looking at an outlay of somewhere probably between 800 million and $1 billion versus going into the Premier League where you can get in for $100 million and you already have existing infrastructure in a stadium. So he's looking at that and saying, look, this is 1/10 the price to get into the Premier League. So I think that's part of what's happening right now. I think generally speaking, I think just the undervalued nature of European sport, whether it's the fact that clubs haven't been run as commercial entities or commercial businesses for the most part, is attractive to investors from North America. And then certainly from a media perspective, more and more people are interested in the sport because of various media avenues that have kind of exploded in the United States, whether that's Ted Lasso or Welcome to Wrexham or the Sunderland documentary. I think obviously you have a lot of people interested in investing in the sport whose children play soccer or maybe they had played soccer. But it's kind of gotten to the point where it's a little bit of a critical mass now where there's so much interest in the sport. I'll give you an example. I was in the UK last weekend and I went to a Wrexham game. I was invited to go to a game and I threw a picture on social media like, hey, I'm at Wrexham. This is cool. And the amount of people that reached out to me, the amount of engagement in social media, just simply because I was at a Wrexham game, which is a fifth-tier club in the UK, was pretty mind-blowing, the amount of interest. And so I think there's a lot of people saying, hey, I want to own a club in Europe because I see what Ryan and Rob have done. It's super exciting. Obviously, it's a separate conversation if you can replicate what they've done, and certainly they've done a lot right. But I think those are high level, a lot of the different factors in terms of specifically why North Americans are looking at European football at this time.
Yeah, it seems like it's finally reaching, let's say, the mass market after so many years, even if there was a World Cup back in '94. But you see a lot of excitement coming out of this recent World Cup, the upcoming World Cup in 2026. I mean, at the end of the day. So I guess that's also part of the reason, no? And then looking into the different ownership models, actually at World Football Summit, we just recently published a report looking at the trends in ownership. And one of the models that was, let's say, identified as more optimal was the multi-sports conglomerates model. So basically where you have your football club and you have maybe a baseball franchise, and then you have, whatever other sports you want to go into. Why do you believe this is the case? Why was it identified as one of the most optimal?
I think you're looking at groups for a couple. Obviously, the multi-club, multi-sport ideas, it's very different. I think it's easy to say that everyone's trying to kind of do the same thing or they're trying to replicate City Football Group. But each group has a kind of a different philosophy. And I think the ones that are the most interesting to me are the ones that are multi-sport. So like, for instance, I know the guys over here who own the San Francisco 49ers, and they've come in and they bought a minority stake in Leeds, and they've slowly increased that stake. And it looks like for all intents and purposes, they're going to buy a majority stake at some point in Leeds in the coming year. And so I think the thought process a bit is, again, certainly for the reasons I described earlier, there's the undervalued nature, number one, of European sport. Number two, I think these groups like the idea of diversifying their investment portfolios as much as owning an NFL team is an extremely lucrative business. I think the idea of, the 49ers guys have leveraged the relationship with Leeds to host watch parties in the UK and try to build their brand in the UK when it comes to the 49ers. So there's ways that the sports can kind of be tied together. If you look at the Bournemouth guys, as I mentioned earlier, you see on social media that they're pushing Bournemouth content on the social media channels of the Las Vegas hockey team, trying to kind of build the fan base through that connection. I generally think, if you're an investor in North American sport and you've successfully run a major sports franchise, I think the idea is, generally speaking, how to run a sports franchise well, and there's no reason that can't translate to European sport. And it's kind of like you're not starting from scratch. You're saying, hey, I ran an NFL team well. I know how to commercialize the business. I know how to build an organization. There's no reason I can't do that in European sport, which is certainly well behind the times. I do think the challenge with that is European sport is very different from North American sport for a variety of reasons. You have just a different structure. You don't have things like salary caps, revenue sharing. You have things like promotion relegation. You have cultural differences between Europe and North America, where sport in North America is very much about how do we craft a structure to make money for our owners, where in European sport, it's much more about these are community assets and, maybe making money is a priority for some organizations, but it's maybe not the top priority. So I think there is that a bit of a cultural adjustment. But I do think the more sophisticated groups are taking a very much diversified approach to multi-asset portfolios, saying, okay, we have a football club in Europe. We have an NFL team in North America. Maybe we have an esports team in Asia. Maybe we have an investment in a sports technology business that's integrated in our portfolio. So I think that more well-rounded way of looking at it, to me, is interesting and very sophisticated. But certainly, of course, you have lots of groups that are saying, yeah, I'm just going to buy football clubs and try to integrate it that way. And it's a difficult model. It's difficult to implement. And we haven't necessarily seen a ton of success in that model, but certainly people are giving it a shot.
Yeah, I think one of the cases that stands out to me is the one with Redbird Capital, with the Yankees and AC Milan. And what was interesting, and as you say, we'll have to see if this works, is how they're trying to, let's say, cross-promote each brand to each other's fans. So essentially, the Yankees are getting more exposure in Italy, while AC Milan is getting more exposure in the United States. And let's see how that, from a brand perspective, I guess you're looking at two entities that have a lot of legacy, history. On paper, it does seem to make some sense. Let's see how that effectively plays out. And then also, but another interesting dynamic, especially over the last year, I would say, is that you'd see large investment funds coming into the space as well. So we're talking about the Sixth Street, CVC, Silver Lake. But for some reason, there's still some doubts regarding their involvement in the industry. And I'm not sure if that's because the perception there is that they might be in there for, let's say, a short, medium term rather than a long term play. What do you believe about that?
I think institutional investors generally are very interested in football and putting their money in this asset class. I think they are, generally speaking, nervous about entering the club space. I think for all the reasons we described, that the risk factors involved in owning a club. Hey, we invest in a club that is lined up to have huge amounts of Champions League money and they don't make it this year, so that hurts the bottom line. I think institutional investors, generally speaking, really like the idea of more secure investments in and around the space. So whether that's media rights, whether that's investing in leagues, you're seeing the Brazilian league being restructured right now and a bunch of private equity groups looking at investing in the league. I think the ecosystem, financing clubs in terms of debt financing. So you're seeing a lot of activity around the space, but you're not necessarily seeing, a CVC Capital go out and buy Manchester United. Certainly not a majority stake. And I don't necessarily think that's going to change because their risk tolerance levels are just different. Their motivations are just different than, let's just say, a high net worth individual. But I do think you're seeing some of the institutionals dip their toes in minority stakes and in more portfolio areas, I think. And I think they're seeing this asset class as being quite undervalued. And they're saying, look, this is an opportunity for us to diversify our portfolios, right? We have hundreds of millions, if not billions, invested in a variety of funds. Why not put a small piece of that into sport, right? So I think that's the thought process. And obviously, every institutional investor has different priorities. I mean, Sixth Street, for instance, you mentioned, is backing one of the bids for an NWSL women's professional franchise here in California. And so that would be a majority stake. And so we don't exactly know how that's going to pan out or if they're going to get the bid. But that would be a really interesting play for a private institutional investor to come in and buy a majority stake of a women's club here in the United States. So things are definitely changing, but I do think there's a cautious approach from those particular type of investors just because of their risk tolerance.
And then I guess the final topic that I want to talk about regarding this report is athlete investment. And it does seem like lately athletes are becoming savvier in terms of the investment portfolios they are building. Although, from my point of view, the American athletes are still 2 steps ahead of the European athletes. But do you think, well, now that we're on it, what do you think that is, that American athletes are savvier or maybe, have taken a more serious approach? And do you see this trend increasing in the future where athletes actually become more involved in clubs from an ownership standpoint?
It's a good question. I think North America, when it just comes to the business side, the commercialization side of the sport, obviously is well ahead of Europe. And I think that has been reflected in the players, current and former players, looking into investing in teams and venture and leveraging their celebrity and their net worth to invest in sport. And so, yes, you've seen LeBron James, you've seen various athletes in North America create venture funds. You've certainly seen some of them invest in teams and leagues. It is changing a little bit. I mean, look at Lionel Messi, right? He's launched basically a venture arm in the United States, and he's launching a clothing brand. And I'm going to assume at some point there's going to be more sports-focused investments. I think when he does come to MLS, he's going to get equity in whatever team he comes to, presumably Miami, and that's probably going to be rolled up into his venture fund. I've noticed definitely, I've been in European football for 5 or 6 years now, and I have noticed a change in that more players, certainly towards the end of their careers, are starting to think about how do they get into more of the finance and the investment side of the sport. I've seen more players launching sports technology startups, whether those are related to football or not related to football. So I think it's changing. I think it's just the simple lack of sophistication when it comes to the finance side of the sport. But certainly European athletes are looking more towards North America. They're saying, look, why can't we create maybe a different scale what some of these other athletes have done? When it comes to team investments, you see Ronaldo owns a team in Spain, and PK has invested in various forms of startups and teams. So I think that's always going to be interesting to athletes. It certainly comes down to their ability in terms of their financing ability. Teams are not cheap investments. And I don't think every athlete certainly has the means or the ability to invest in a team, but it certainly depends on their motivations and whatnot. But I've seen much more activity from players and former players on the kind of venture side, which I think is really interesting. It kind of fits with the athlete mentality, I think. And so I have no reason to believe that's not going to continue to grow into the future.
It does seem like definitely, because I think everybody is looking at how others are doing it and how they're benefiting it. It's really easy to say, hey, I want some of that as well, no? Mm-hmm. So I want to understand, Jordan, and again, this is not financial advice. This is only for informational purposes, but based on what we were speaking about, the differences between American and European athletes, in terms of opportunities, do you think that Europe has, let's say, more, less, or the same amount of opportunities as the ones that we can find in America?
Yeah, I think North America, it's kind of a saturated market when it comes to the investment in sport. I think you're looking at price, like as I said earlier, you're looking at price points of clubs and teams, and it's a mature market when it comes to the investment in sport. I think there's opportunities certainly outside of teams. Maybe there's venture opportunities, sports technology opportunities, player performance opportunities in North America. But I don't see any area. I would have said the last area would have been women's sport and women's soccer in North America. And even that at this point is getting to price points that I think are somewhat mature, I would say. So I think European sport is still an immature market when it comes to the way these clubs are run. I think there are opportunities, whether it's going as big as Manchester United or as smaller league like we did in Denmark. I think there are opportunities to not only commercialize these clubs, run them more efficiently, get in at the right price points, but kind of capitalize on the opportunities because simply the structure in Europe is set up in a way that's not necessarily designed to maximize revenues and maximize profits. So I think that those opportunities will always be there. Do I think it's easy to do that and easy to execute? Absolutely not. We might talk about that later in the conversation, but I think the opportunities are 100% there in Europe.
Yeah, I think about the example of pickleball, just how quickly that has risen, and then how many athletes have gone, in the space. It's been very quick.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, in terms of and we'll speak. You mentioned Manchester United before, and we'll speak about that. But first, I want to ask you a question. It seems we're headed for a market correction. How do these market corrections impact the sports industry? Do you think it has obviously you have major events like a pandemic, but this is a more economic market correction. Do you think the sports industry is going to get impacted by it?
I think we're seeing a little bit already. I think over the last 6 months, there's been a little bit of a slowdown in M&A activity. I think you're seeing the price points for assets that do sell maybe aren't going quite as high as people think. And I would be surprised if the assets that are out there, whether it's Liverpool, Manchester United, end up selling majority or minority stakes at the valuations that people are putting on them. So I certainly think there's an effect. The greater overall economic environment always will affect investment in sports. But again, sports is a kind of a different asset class. You're dealing with high net worth individuals and institutional investors that are somewhat shielded a bit from the greater economic kind of uncertainty. So I think barring a full-blown global recession, which we're certainly not there yet, it's unclear if that's going to happen. I don't foresee any major market corrections necessarily. But again, it's hard to tell. It's a little bit uncertain right now, but I have noticed a bit of slowdown in M&A activity in the near future. We'll see if that continues into 2023. Certainly, the economic environment, whether it's media rights, whether it's viewership, whether it's attendance, all those numbers are quite strong in the sport. There's been no downturns there. There's been a pretty strong rebound from COVID on that. And to be fair, if you look at the environment over 3 years during the pandemic, I think there was an expectation that clubs were going to go bankrupt. It was going to destroy the financial model of most teams. And frankly, that didn't happen. Yeah, there was certainly some clubs that were distressed and there were transactions that took place, but it was nowhere near the kind of fire sale that a lot of people expected. So I guess that goes to a point in terms of, sports as an asset class maybe being a little bit shielded from larger economic trends.
And in that regard, if some investment group or firm is looking to invest, I guess, it really depends on each firm's playbook and their strategy. But do you think it makes more sense to invest in, let's say, clubs or leagues or competitions that, let's say, experience high growth? For example, a women's football club could be an example. Or is it, let's say, safer to build a multi-sport portfolio where you can actually diversify from different sports? Do you have any thoughts on that, or it really depends?
Yeah, obviously it depends on the philosophy of each investment portfolio. But for me personally, I like to do things differently. I like high growth opportunities. So for instance, investing in the league in Brazil, for instance, I think that's an incredibly high growth opportunity. Now, obviously, it has a lot of challenges, structural challenges to kind of herd the teams together to get them all on the same page. But if you can think of where that league is now on a global perspective and where it could be with the right management and the right equity investment and the right investment, you can say, look, this could be a top 8 league, top 10 league in the world right now. Now it's certainly not close to that. So, of course, diversification is important, and I think you could probably do a little bit of both. You can diversify in a way where you have some parts of your portfolio is very high growth and some parts are more secure investments. I think something like debt financing for clubs, you're just basically being a bank at this point that happens to loan money to football clubs. And I think that's a very low risk, generally speaking, piece of the industry, depending on how smart you are in terms of who you loan money to, versus investing in a club that maybe is distressed or has high relegation risk, where a Bournemouth, for instance, is another one, right? Where, that is a reasonably high risk investment, right? You're looking at a club that has high relegation risk, that needs infrastructure investment, that has a lot of growth opportunities because the purchase was undervalued, but it does have a lot of risk involved. So again, I can't answer that. It just depends on each individual investor. But for me,
Yeah.
some sort of diversified investment portfolio with high growth as a piece of that is the sweet spot, I think.
Um, you mentioned before the pandemic how everything seemed that it was going to be a disaster, and at the end of the day, the football industry bounced back. Um, Even if we're heading for a market correction and things may slow down a little bit, it does seem like finally the football industry has recovered or is on a path to recovery. So, in that sense, what are you most, let's say, excited about when it comes to the future of the football industry? And I guess the flip side to that is there anything you would be cautious about if you would have to recommend anything to football industry leaders?
I think what's most exciting to me is emerging football markets. I think there's opportunities. Of course, there's always opportunities in Western Europe. That's the space that I'm quite familiar with. And I think there's always going to be opportunities coming in and buying big clubs and modernizing them and growing the game. But I think there's just massive opportunities in places like South America, Australia, Asia, places where there's been little to no investment from a foreign perspective into those markets. I think you go to places like Indonesia or Japan, these places, football is just immensely popular, both domestically and globally. And I think there is an opportunity from a variety of angles, everything from identifying players and talent and building academies to commercialization to all women's football. I think there's opportunity in these markets where other people aren't looking. I mean, one example is I know the guys a little bit at Sport Republic, which is a multi-club group out of the UK, and they own Southampton. And they recently bought a club in Turkey. And I think
Yeah.
obviously Turkey can be a challenging place to do business as potentially other emerging football markets are to a certain extent. But they are first movers in that market. And I think that's really interesting where they can learn best practices in terms of Turkish football, identifying talent, kind of figuring out the best way to run a football club in that market when no one else is there. And I think that is interesting to me, whereas a lot of what happens in this industry is everyone kind of doing the same thing. Everyone going into Belgium or Portugal or Denmark and saying, we're going to develop and sell players. Well, guess what? Like, there's about 15 other clubs in each one of those countries spending a lot of money doing exactly the same thing, right? Or we want to go buy a club and we want to do a documentary following the growth of our club. Well, guess what? There's like 10 other clubs who've done that already. So I'm very much a proponent of, like, if you're going to come into this industry, it's not to say you have to buy a club in Indonesia, but it's saying, let's at least have a philosophy and a strategy of how we're going to at least try something a little bit different, how we're going to have some sort of competitive advantage. And that competitive advantage might be we're just smart business people and we're going to run a better business than other people. And that's fine if that's what it is. But what excites me the most is these ideas and business models in areas that other people aren't thinking about. On the flip side, I think the challenge that I see is, to a certain extent, a lot of foreign and American investors having somewhat a lack of appreciation for the difficulty in running these businesses and thinking, as I said earlier, hey, I've run an NBA team really well. I can come in and run a European football club, no problem. And it's really very, very difficult. As I mentioned earlier, I think there needs to be a humility when it comes being a foreign investor. And that's not just going into the UK, for instance, but going into some of these other countries. There's cultural differences, language differences. There's, everything from labor law and tax law and employment law. Everything is very, very different. And so I think I'm very much a proponent that these groups need to understand what they don't know. They need to bring in really good people who understand both European football and whatever domestic market it is, and make sure that helps them learn and make better decisions. Because if they don't, there's lots of historical, horror stories of foreign ownership groups coming into the sport, not really having a sense of what they should be doing, losing a lot of money and going home. And to a certain extent, as the sport has become more sophisticated, we're still seeing that. I still see that. And so I think that humility is really important. So long story short, there's huge opportunities in the space, but I think it takes the right group with the right strategy and mindset. And you mentioned Redbird earlier, right? Like, I know those guys really well. They took a really interesting approach, right? They went into European football and said, we're not going to go straight for AC Milan right off the bat. They went in and they bought Toulouse to start, which is not a small club by any stretch, but is not in,
It's not Milan.
And they did a really good job. They have an in-house data analytics team that is probably the best in the business, Zealous Analytics. They implemented that really well. They brought in a couple of really, really savvy operators who know French football, who I know quite well, are really smart people. And they had success. They got their club promoted. They're a mid-table team right now in Liga. They've sold players at a very impressive clip. And then they decided, okay, great, we've shown proof of concept, and now we're going to go buy a club in Italy. So I think that sophisticated, smart strategy makes a lot of sense, but certainly not every group takes that approach.
Actually, that's something we talked about during the first time you were in the podcast. And you also, it's a message that you shared on the panel of WFS Europe. And I fully agree. At the end of the day, it's better to start from the base to really understand the markets, like any business operation at the end of the day, no? So yeah, fully agree on that.
And I
And
mean,
then
look,
also,
that was our strategy in Denmark. I think I had a lot of questions of why did you
exactly.
go to Denmark? Why'd you go to a small club? And the idea was, look, we're going to learn, we're going to understand, we're going to make mistakes, we're going to do it at a small scale. And once we can show proof of concept, like you would show in any other business, then we'll scale upwards. And many of the investors in my group that were involved in my project are now part of other groups and part of Premier League groups. Obviously, I'm working on other projects. And so we've shown proof of concept that we understand and know how to run European football clubs in a smart and efficient way. And I think that certainly not everyone has the time and patience to spend 3 years in a place like Denmark to learn, but I think it's really important. And I don't think I could be successful in any sort of future ventures in European football without that basis of experience.
And that's what I was going to say. The commitment. At the end of the day, you committed to the project, and that commitment is not just a financial resource type of thing. It's also time. And you were traveling, and you were there, and you were with the people, and you were talking to the people. At the end of the day, that also gives you an edge to really do things well. That's something that
you can't get that understanding sitting from a couch in New York or San Francisco, right? You have to be on the ground. I spent 2 weeks a month in Scandinavia for almost 3 years straight, and that's hard. And I realize not everyone can make that kind of commitment. But if you want to go into sport in Europe, you need to have either yourself as an investor or institutional. You need to have people you know and trust who can make that kind of commitment. And if they can't, you should not buy into European sport because simply it's not going to work otherwise.
Yep, agree. Well, thank you for that. I want to move on to the, let's say, final section of the conversation, because during our first conversation, we talked about culture and leadership. You had many lessons that the industry can learn from. And I saw another LinkedIn post that you shared the other day where you said that almost half of the League One clubs in France had already sacked their manager this season. And that is obviously, a huge risk to the stability of a club. Why do you think this is happening?
So one of the reasons it's specifically happening this year is because there's a restructure of the French league. So the league is, I believe, going from 20 teams to 18 teams, Liga. And so there's 4 teams getting relegated this year out of 20. So obviously that's putting more pressure on more clubs that are in the relegation mix in terms of, the pressure to stay up in the league. So I think, look, at the end of the day, there's so much money riding on staying in these top divisions, whether it's the Premier League, whether it's Liga, that I think there's always going to be a pressure to say, well, we're heading towards a relegation, so we need to fire our manager and bring in one. And I'm sympathetic to that. I understand the difficulty in terms of the different price points when your revenue between the two different divisions. But that being said, if you're hiring and firing managers every 6 months, there's no stability in your organization. There's no way you can create a culture and create a playing style and create any sort of sustainability in a way that you can create results. We had one coach and one sporting director and one CEO for 3 straight seasons in Denmark. And that was one of our keys to success in terms of being able to maintain that stability in an organization. And again, I'm not saying that there isn't the right time and the right place that you need to make a change when it comes to managers, but I think the constant shifting, the constant hiring and firing, there's no way you can possibly be successful. Your players, your staff, your physio, everyone around the organization looks and sees a different person with a different philosophy and a different skill set coming into your organization. And there's just no possible way you can be successful under that kind of climate. And so I think the pressure of, the financial pressures kind of cause that, but it's like you have to kind of take a step back and be rational and make a decision just saying, yes, okay, maybe there is no possible way we can succeed under this current management and we do have to make a change. But if we make a change, we better make sure this is the right change, because in another 3 months, we cannot make another change, right? Because then we're going down a road that's just not going to work. And so it's difficult. There's definitely not necessarily one right answer. I think it's hard to say, you're always under pressure to say, well, if we keep this manager, what are our chances of staying up in this particular league versus getting rid of this manager? But, there's obviously external pressures from fans, from the media. It can be difficult to make sound, rational decisions under that environment. But, like I said, I think it's very, very difficult to have constant, turmoil at the head of your organizations and have success. I don't see any way it can be possible.
In fact, we talked about a framework during our first conversation that had three pillars, which was culture, stability, and leadership. No.
Yeah.
So, based on your experience and the knowledge that you have of the industry, is there any football club that stands out as an example of carrying that framework out?
I mean, I think Liverpool, right? Jurgen Klopp's been there for quite some time. They've had really good sound ownership, making good decisions with the Fenway Sports Group. I think, City Football Group's a pretty gold standard, a pretty strong gold standard when it comes to the way they run their businesses. Pep Guardiola's been there for quite some time. So, I think there are certainly examples at the top of clubs that are well run. I think, Eddie Howe, when he was at Bournemouth, he was there for a while, had a lot of success, and now he's doing that again at Newcastle. So I think, you know, as I mentioned in our last conversation, culture and stability and all these things we talk about, they're driven by people. And if you can hire good people and bring in good people, give them the tools to be successful and the support to be successful, you will have success. Now, obviously, it doesn't necessarily last forever. You look at what's happening in Liverpool right now, and they definitely kind of need to refresh a little bit the way of looking at things because they're struggling a bit at the moment. But I think you bring in good people, you make good decisions, you hire sound people who build good culture, and that will get you 85% of the way there. Obviously, you can't necessarily control for results or injuries or things out of your control. But generally speaking, there are clubs that do it well and have stability. I think the opposite end of the spectrum is clubs like an Everton or clubs towards that you see that there's constant instability and they're making bad decisions or they're spending money in inefficient ways. And so you're saying, guess what? Like that's what it looks like when you don't make good decisions. You don't hire good people and you don't have stability at the top. And so I think it's easy to say and easy to do, but difficult to implement. But once you get it right, once you have the right people in place, you will have success per the clubs I mentioned earlier.
And in a way, that translates into financial success as well. That long-term stability. I mean, there's obviously many factors to it, but you mentioned Manchester and Liverpool, and they just made it both to the top three of the Deloitte Money League report.
I mean, look, at the end of the day, everything is, so much of your revenue in this sport is tied to on-field success, right? Whether it's Champions League prize money, whether it's media rates, Champions League money, prize money, media rights money, and if you have stability on the pitch with a good, sound product and win games, that will translate to higher revenues and larger valuations and all that kind of stuff. It's all tied together.
Definitely. And then as we were talking about, the market correction, what advice would you have for football industry leaders during this time where, there's going to be pressure from not only internal forces, but also external forces? Anything that you would want to share?
I mean, my advice generally is always that people need to make good, sound decisions, run their businesses efficiently, don't waste, right? I think there's a lot of clubs that waste money and they spend too much on agent fees and overpay players, whether it's on transfer fees or wages. Whether the economic climate is great or it's poor, you should be running a good, sound, efficient business. And that's not to say that you need to wring every penny out of a football club, because I don't subscribe to that belief. I don't believe football clubs should be used as vehicles to just be solely for profit. But I do think in order to have long-term sustainability, clubs need to be run efficiently. You need to make good decisions. So I think, what's happening at Chelsea right now is a good example in terms of, they're making some decisions, signing very long-term contracts, spending a lot of money. And, they believe those are the right decisions and maybe those will work out in the long run. But, obviously if they miss on some of those decisions, it's going to hurt them financially to the future. So I think it's thinking about how we make better decisions, and in whatever economic climate it is, how do we make sure we run a good, sound, efficient club and business? And some clubs do that, some clubs don't. And I think it's just when the economic climate is definitely more negative, I think it's even more important to run a tighter ship and a better business.
Agree. Fully agree. Well, Jordan, this has been as good as expected. Before we close off, I don't know if you have any last words or messages that you want to share with the audience that maybe we didn't talk about today.
No, I don't think so. I appreciate you taking the time. Looking forward to the World Football Summit event in Spain in the fall, and always happy to talk about this stuff. Something obviously I'm very passionate about. I like to see football clubs that are well run and sustainable. And so, I appreciate you taking the time.
Will you join us for World Football Summit?
I will be there, yes.
Fantastic. That's great. So, Jordan, thank you. Where can people learn more about what you do or follow you or any?
Yeah, Twitter, MR, Mr. Jordan Gardner on Twitter. That's probably the best spot to find me. And DMs are always open. Happy to answer any questions. So send me a message. Always happy to help.
Fantastic, Jordan. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to bringing you back a third time.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you. And there you have him, Jordan Gardner, with a masterclass on the investment landscape around the football industry and culture and leadership. Key takeaways for me from this amazing conversation. First, why are Americans entering the football industry with such force? Well, clubs in European football are undervalued when compared to other football competitions like the MLS or even the NWSL. Soccer has finally reached the mass market in the United States. This has several reasons: improved quality, technology, and broadcasting enabling to watch games from anywhere in the world, or even pop culture elements like Ted Lasso or Ryan Reynolds becoming involved in Wrexham. Second, European sport is very different from American. We're talking about, caps in revenue sharing, promotion and relegation. There's actually no salary cap in Europe. There are many cultural differences around the sport. Owners who invest in European football must be ready to commit time, not just resources. Third, if you're going to enter the football industry, you need a philosophy and a strategy to develop a differentiated playbook. In that sense, have a roadmap to show proof of concept as you build your way up to bigger clubs. Finally, the sports industry is generally resilient to market corrections, but in these current times, the framework of culture, leadership, and stability is as important as ever. But at the end of the day, they are driven by people. You need good people to build a culture in the organization. That gets you 85% of the way there. Is there anything else that stood out for you? If so, please reach out across social media and let us know. And remember, you can subscribe and rate the podcast on the platform of your choice and share it with the colleagues in the industry. Remember, you can grab a free copy of the report at our website, www.worldfootballsummit.com. Nothing else from my side. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the World Football Summit podcast. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you next time.